So I'm delighted to pass over to Des O'Connell, who will be introducing Eyal to you all. Over to you, Des.
Thank you, Alana, and welcome everybody. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Eyal Pavell, who's going to talk to us about the power of context. Some of you will know Eyal as a tutor on the Meyler Campbell Mastered Programme, where he's a member of faculty and a tutor. You may also know him from modules he's taught on the Psychology Distilled programme that we've run over many years. Eyal's background, he's a clinical psychologist by training. He started his career in New York, working in a psychiatric hospital there, and later as an organisational psychologist. For the past 20 years, he's been working as a coach and consultant in the corporate world. And so he's going to share with us this afternoon some of his experiences, and particularly some of the tools he uses in working with clients to help them gain an awareness of the powerful effects that context and the environment can have on us and our clients. So Eyal, welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Des and Alana, and thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar, where I'll be discussing the big question of to what extent are we masters of our fates, or are we products of our environments, and looking at the implications that it has for coaching. So moving to the next slide, you see here we have two quotes from the opposing sides of the spectrum. The top one unambiguously puts the power of agency in us, in our minds, and by extension, our skills, our capabilities, our personalities, the things that we bring to the table. And taking the opposing view is the one below from Angela Duckworth, is that, yes, we might have willpower, but it doesn't really count for much, particularly in the face of the more powerful external forces. And I would like to approach this topic from a number of angles that is described here on the left-hand side of this kind of rough agenda, starting off with the more straightforward physical effects of our environments, the psychological effects of the environments on us, and then moving on to talk about systems thinking. So looking outside of ourselves to understand how we are affected and how we impact others in our systems and in the networks of our relationships, with particular attention to the organizational forces that are at play. And this is whether the clients bring these into the coaching session explicitly or not. And I do think that we as coaches sometimes need to be the ones that at least question it or shine some kind of light on the system. And I'll expand on the power of a social system. So what happens to people when they are in groups or in teams, and how that affects behaviors and feelings, and in particular decision-making. And then we'll spend the latter time of the presentation part of this webinar summing up the practical implications that we as coaches can apply. So looking at the question of who is responsible or what is responsible, we will apply a biopsychosocial lens to take a holistic views of different levels that we are looking at. So the psychological, which is the one in red, that refers to the quality of the person. So their personality, their abilities, their history, their experience, etc. The biological refers to the parts of the person. So the bits and the pieces that we're all made of, our biology and our physiology. And then the social refers to everything that is outside of us. So the people, the setting, the environment. And this biopsychosocial model posits that our behavior, our thinking, our well-being is affected by all three. And we are also, as individuals, we are affected by them. And in particular, we will be talking about how the environment affects us on these three levels and how we can weave that into our work as coaching. So in one of the key phrases that is used here is a fundamental attribution error. And this is the erroneous thinking, apparently, that we or our intentions, our values, who we are masters of our own domain. But actually, much of the research proves that this is not the case. And I'd like to start unpacking parts of that research And I'd like to turn first of all to our immediate everyday experiences in environments. That'll be the next slide, please. So as we place ourselves as one of the people in this first picture, we have a certain feeling, a certain experience, which is probably very different to the one that we feel if we place ourselves in the next scenario. Okay. Or the next, there's also examples from architectures and building design. And we can see how this type of building affects us very differently to this kind of structure. And this is on the everyday level. But now I'd like to go one level deeper and talk about not just some diffuse feeling or experience, but really the way that we're affected by our environments in terms of our moods, our responses to stress, and behaviors in ways that are quite deep and actually in some ways predictable to an extent. So in large systems like organizations, the environment reflects power and affects power. So a clever person once said, you can tell who has the power in any given place by looking at who builds the tallest structures. And if we look at palaces and cathedrals of the past and who are the ones building the tallest buildings, you know, in our city today, I think that tallies up quite well and gives us a pretty good indication which group sets the tone in its own time. But let's open up the biological and psychological effects of the physical environment. So a large body of research here. And you can see some of the findings, like the connection to nature and what it does to us, how it makes us feel. This is what is behind the Japanese notion of forest bathing, and it's also now being considered by the NHS as kind of nature therapy. It's what is behind sending people for months on months to recuperate in sanitariums in the Alps, very common in the first half of the 20th century. But it also affects how we socialize. So that the setting around us, whether it's urban planning, whether it's the design, it affects how we move. It affects how we think. It affects how we see that in urban planning. We see that in negotiations. You come across tactics that are not to do only with the content of what we're saying, but rather with the physical setup. So where to sit around the table, who sits next to who sits on a higher chair or different colors or different backgrounds. The bullet point around epigenetics, this is a relatively new field of scientific research, and it shows increasingly that there is a far greater interaction between DNA and the environment than we previously thought. And actually DNA is less fixed and it's much more reactive and responsive. So it actually changes in response to the environment around us, and we even inherit it to the next generations. For instance, if there are traumatic experiences, they pass through our DNA because our DNA has interacted in this way. And another fascinating area of research is mirror neurons. So these are actual receptors in our brains that act like an internal screen. So what we see on the outside is actually almost physically represented inside our brain, which in turn kicks off a number of neural networks, particularly around empathy and around fear. And this is thought to be a unique evolutionary mechanism at play. There is, if we can please move to be able to look at the impact of mental health and other things, actually, other behaviors, which George Lakoff in the late 70s coined the term embodied cognition, which is like an umbrella term describing how our environment affects us. And you can see some of the examples here. So the priming effect, for instance, this happens a lot in advertising. So certain colors have a direct impact on us. So for instance, orange is biologically connected to our appetite. system. And it's no coincidence that the color schemes in many supermarkets and fast food restaurants are orange and or yellow and red. So they're used to kind of prime people, so to kind of prepare them, quote unquote, to engage in certain behaviors that are desired. You can see some other findings, again, about the very widespread effects that environments have on how we respond to things, how we feel, and our moods and our socializing. And next, I'd like to share with you a little bit about the Langer experiment, which is described in the next slide. And this was conducted in the late 70s. And old 70-plus-year-old men, in this case, were brought into a setting that was changed to look and to sound and to feel just like it was when they were at the prime of their life. And they were asked to just behave and go about their business, listening to music from the late 50s and surrounded by the decor from the era. And then what they did is they measured and observed and measured how they behaved and looked at their cognitive functioning and their moods and other physical measurements. And the findings were quite spectacular. Alana, if I can ask to share the findings. So there was really across the board improvement in both physical, motor, perceptual. You see things like memory and cognition and hearing and in vision. And these were really all thanks to the changes in the environment. And another, what I would say is a pretty strong attestation to how profoundly the environment affects us, even if it's just a physical environment. And we'll talk more and more about different social environments. So when we talk about the social environment, a useful way is to see us as part of a system. So we are placed always somewhere amongst others. So our place, our influence, our power, our behavior always sits within a context and is relative. We play a role. And just like using this metaphor that you see of the solar system, our Earth ended up with a certain climate and atmosphere, not just because the composition of the minerals and the gases that this planet is made of, but really also it's very highly dependent on the distance from the sun, which in turn affects the gravitational pull, the intensity of light and energy. And those two things together really are what determine the temperature on our planet, the composition of the air, the length of our days or season, the biology on the planet, etc. And the other planets, so it's not just the sun, it's also the other planets that surround us. And if any one of them moved by a mere few light years, that would change our orbit, so the orbit of the Earth, even though the change actually happened somewhere far and quite distant. But it's because we are part of a system. And if we go with this metaphor, we can start thinking about things in systems terms and try to understand the dynamics and work with the system and with this information. Turning our attention, and even though we're coaching just one person, we can help them understand how they sit within an environment that has powers that really should be appreciated, and then we can help them work with the system. It's very hard to change a system. We can only help them work within it. And in fact, each of us belongs to many systems, okay? So if we're the central red dot, we have the nearest systems that we belong to, whether it's our family and friends, whether it's our team or department at work, etc. Then we have more distant systems, so the looser connections in the mesosystem. The exosystem is the indirect level. We see that around us now. You know, what happens, a health crisis thousands of miles away, how that is affecting us now, how supply chain breakdowns you know, in America are impacting how much food we have in the supermarket and our own behavior as consumers and the food that we prepare, et cetera, et cetera. Beyond that are the social and cultural values and the larger changes over time, which is our cultural, demographic changes, technological changes. So we sit in many systems and many connections. Some are activated and are live, and some are more dormant, but they're always there, and there's always the potential for things to kick in. And the more we know about it, the better we can help in helping our coachees dealing with their challenges. So what are some ways that we can pay attention to systems and understand them better? And here are some kind of key principles. And by the way, systems thinking is not just a psychology or certainly a coaching thing. It's also found in economics and in other disciplines that deal with complexity. And the key entryway is that we look significantly at what goes on in the system, probably before we look at what happens with one of its components. Or we can only understand the component if we have the view on the system in its entirety, and that we will bring into coaching as well. So we interact with everything. Sometimes we collude. So we're in certain relationships, we enable things, even if we could be doing that passively or actively. And things affect us, and any relationship and any social relationship is really a two-way system. And even though we, our coachees, may know that theoretically, that point is sometimes lost when people are really so focused on what they see as their own issue or a problem that they themselves only are needing to deal with. So it's really helpful to see how, just to understand that we are active players in a system, and that a change in a system will affect other parts. And that means a change in somebody else will affect us. And also, if we behave differently, or if our coachee behaves differently, that will affect the other person and how they respond to us and to other parts of the system. Okay, so it also helps in really highlighting the personal responsibility of the coachee, but in some ways not overdoing it, and helping them also understand the limits of their personal responsibility, while being empowering in highlighting it where they do have control and where they can impact things. And the range of factors that operate, okay, some of them are visible, so things that can be observed easily and maybe even predicted, but some that are not. So when it comes to a people lens or a psychology lens, so we call this conscious and unconscious. So an example of a conscious effect is looking at the organizational chart and understanding the organizational hierarchy. So it's very clear that those above me in the hierarchy have more decision-making power. It's known, it's not a secret, it's built into the system. On the other hand, an example of an unconscious dynamic at work are relationships and psychological factors that happen between individuals or between teams that are not formal, they're not even discussed. So the CEO may be sitting above the COO, but if the COO is actually more respected, even feared than the CEO is, then it's the COO that de facto is calling the shots. So this would not be said, but it would be felt and it would be experienced, and it would be very real in terms of how it makes people feel, certainly, and then also how it affects their behavior. And on a group level, there are unconscious effects, and they can look like things like competition, aggression, envy, things like that, that again, that are sensed, but very seldom brought to the surface. Okay. And a system always wants to remain stable, just like our solar system wants to, keep the 10 planets going around the sun. In organizations, people want to find their place, take up the role, keep it, and succeed in it. Now, if somebody wants a promotion, that would be an example of them wanting to find a different place in the existing system. And just like the planetary system has its kind of rules and forces, so do other systems. So if there's a vacuum of power, it will soon be filled, for instance. And we see that in politics, we see that in organizations. Another almost truism is that things with a smaller mass will always rotate around the ones with a larger mass. It never works the other way around, unless the system is approaching game over and spiraling into a black hole. Okay. So this is what we mean by the system forces. And then the final point, that systems are often part of larger systems, which also resonates with the slide we saw before, that we actually belong to many systems, and so does the system that we are part of. Okay, whether it's the industry, the segment, the national economy, etc. So organizational forces, and here I start with the quote by Peter Drucker, the leadership guru, who places culture as being more important than strategy. And here I think he also means, hard business plans or financial models. And culture being really, an environmental, somewhat perhaps vague notion, but incredibly powerful. And there are a number of levels to this. So every system has its explicit forces. These are the regulations, the procedures, the things that are written on the wall and on the taglines, the titles. But it also has others which are more symbolic, which are the brands, how things look, the tradition, the vernacular that's used, which sometimes, some organizations are quite, have quite a strong kind of symbolic character, and some different industries also have that kind of symbolic unifying measures, like their own language and their own kind of way of doing things. The next level below that is the behavioral one. So these are roles and responsibilities. So people in the system and what they are needing to do and how they will be rewarded, and what are the processes around here, and what are the promotion systems, and how these things happen and when these things happen. Okay, so again, this is mostly visible, and then we're down at the unconscious one, which is the unwritten rules, the power dynamic, and the things that are not said. Okay. And coaching would usually happen on the latter two levels, so on the unconscious level and on the behavioral level. And sometimes the coachee, our client, would be sitting and holding some kind of dissonance between what is explicit and how things really work around here. Or if they came from a different organization, they will be confused and baffled by the unwritten things and how things work differently, even though the two companies, on paper might look quite the same. So systems mapping is a useful tool that can be done with clients and very quickly. Okay, so we can even ask the client to draw a picture of their system. So in this case, the client would be A, and they'd be surrounded by others. And we note the quality of the relationships that they have with each of the players in the system, and also the relationships between the other players. Okay, and when we do this in coaching, it's helpful if it's done on the backdrop of a particular goal. So around achieving success, around increasing level of collaboration, managing a team, working toward promotion, we kind of get this lay of the land. And often just the act of laying out the system and thinking about and noting the relationships and the quality of the interactions can really help, both in terms of seeing the reasons why things are not working well, or there's certain blockages or challenges or obstacles. And also it makes certain solutions easier to see. So, perhaps we need to fix the relationship between A and C, or this alliance between C and B, kind of what does that mean about, how F is doing, and how does that affect everybody else and the things that are going on here. So you can use this to start a discussion, and it's a really good focus point to understand the causes why the relationship looks the way it is. What are the important pivot points in the relationship? Who are the important players? And then explore together with the coachee, in whatever way that you as a coach work, ways to repair broken relationships and help the coachee move towards their goal. And so this is just a suggestion for an exercise. And there's another example that we can share briefly around a systems map for influencing. This is an educational institution. So again, kind of influencing, it's another way of indicating the types of relationship, but it's basically also another version of systems mapping. And then you can decide on, is everybody who needs to be included, who's against the change, who's for the change, to what extent people are involved and engaged in the change. So you can really cut it in different ways. Okay. Thank you. So now let's talk about other ways to kind of coach with the system in mind. Okay, so we look at, and the first two might even be close to the GROW model. So what is a desired state? So what's going on, not just from the coachee's point of view. So it's not just, I want to be promoted, but also how does it fit with other parts of the system? So how would that affect my peers? What is what's the boss's point of view about that? How many other people are competing for the job, et cetera, et cetera. And really through the type of exercise that we saw, and here we can use the kind of system mapping, is really understanding the context in ways that go beyond the quality of and what your coachee brings in as an individual. Okay. The next things we can do are help the person understand how they impact the system and the different players. This is particularly useful when people get feedback that they're not seen as team players, or feedback that they're not visible enough, or that they're not being seen as effective, or things where there's a difference between their intentions and actually how other people in the system see them. Okay, so, and then what does the system bring out in the person? Okay, and people, we saw even just a few examples of the different levels in which our environment can affect us. So you can see that as, for instance, if there's a reorganization, that usually causes people, it changes our part of the system. The effect that it has on us is that it will unsettle us. We will, tend to reach for the people we know. Depending on our personality, we might withdraw, we might become more active. But these are the kinds of things where you discuss the coachee's response also from the point of view of the other players in the system. Okay, and then the question really is, okay, so where to make the changes in the self, in the environment? So is it about how the coachee responds to something, or is it about needing to collaborate more closely, or to identify, to bring in decision makers, or to make sure that my team is more cohesive, because where right now there are subgroups, so how to bring people together. That would be an example of changes that we can start making in the environment that then will affect not just the environment, but our coachees, in our own well-being. And then it's how to make the changes and how to make sure they're sustainable in the system. And here you can proceed in the normal way that you might do coaching. Okay, but this awareness helps empower things and helps tackle things that otherwise might really be in a danger of falling and not being seen. So let's move to talk about the effects that teams and just groups of people doing things have on our own individual behavior. So the first quite a famous experiment done in the 60s by Milgram, where people in different rooms, some were told to be the ones asking questions of people who were in separate rooms. And they were asked to give electric shocks whenever the responders gave an incorrect answer. And this was done on a scale of electric current that kind of went up and up and up. And it was also designated, this is just a mild shock, this is a little bit uncomfortable, and it went all the way to potentially lethal. And disappointingly, one may say that 2/3 of the people who were the mock punishers actually turned the dial all the way up to the point where they knew it was, potentially lethal. And this finding was replicated in several studies that were of higher ethical standards. I'd like to add, this kind of experiment would never be allowed today. And the conclusion really is that social forces are so incredibly powerful and really, account for so much of how individuals behave and cause people to behave in ways that otherwise they wouldn't. I mean, they're only behaving in these ways because there are other people around them who are behaving or who are taking up different roles. Zimbardo's prison experiment, there were mock prisoners and mock guards, and this was done with college students. And again here, the guards were given free rein in terms of what kind of punishments they could give. Within a few days, the guards went so over the top that they had to stop the experiment. And in subsequent interviews, people tried to explain how they behaved, and they came up with all sorts of reasons. But the power really of a role here, again, it's not so much the individual, it's what happens to a person when they take on a role within a system and how strong an effect that has on them. Now, hopefully, as coaches, we won't have to be dealing with things like authority and punishment and obedience and electric shocks, but we will potentially be dealing with groups and teams and boards and how they work. So groupthink started by psychologists trying to understand the failures of policy making during the Vietnam War and then extended to other political and organizational institutions. And really basically trying to look at why teams of intelligent, experienced professionals get things so badly wrong. And again and again in many experiments, certain dynamics are seen to build up and they lead to the things that we see here as poor decisions. So very narrow decision making, not looking at facts, being quite insular, and also creating kind of an us and them. So we are right and anybody else who is thinking otherwise is wrong. We can see that now in the newspapers in terms of the response to the various pieces of research and who's listening to who and who's been making the decisions around COVID, both in this country, but elsewhere too. And risky shift is another notion. So it kind of builds on what we've just described and the dynamics that happens in groups. And you see how things just polarize, okay, around risk. And also can really deteriorate into people really demonstrating defense mechanisms that build up and almost suck everybody into some pretty dangerous psychological states, like paranoia, like grandiosity, like scapegoating, like invincibility, which people, the same individuals would not have been prone to, or would have not behaved in those ways had they not been part of that group. So things polarize and the reality check is diminished. Okay, we get into, in groups, things kind of take over and we spiral. And it's very important to note that these statements about groups, homogeneous groups in general, that fall into these dynamics. It's not really about individual differences or capabilities or intelligence or experience. It's about the specific types of momentums that happen in groups. Okay. So beware of uniformity and kind of in groups making important decisions. So this is a very brief nod to cultural differences. Obviously a vast and increasingly relevant aspect of organizational life, very active field of research that we don't have the scope to cover right now. But what we did list are the 5 critical dimensions that are seen to be the ones where countries vary across. So each culture can be mapped. So some country would have a high power distance that is between individuals, kind of level of formality and distance. So some countries, that's a very wide distance where things are very formal. In other countries, those kind of hierarchical distances are minimal. It's individualism versus collectivism. To what degree people really focus on themselves and competitive environment, or being competitive versus working more to a communal goal. How cultures deal with uncertainty, and this is, as you can imagine, very closely tied to decision making. So to what extent they avoid uncertainty actually, and how much of an obstacle and a kind of a showstopper it is in some cultures versus the others, how important consensus is, and the structure and formality in which a culture works. So these would be the 5 ways that are seen to be the key differentiator between cultures. Now, if you've been an expat or you've had experience in managing people who come from different cultures, it's useful to think about these things and try to distill some of the differences that you might have seen, and to appreciate that these things run very, very deep. They're easy to miss because they're so ingrained and there's so much in the background. And we assume that every environment operates according to the same kind of operating principles of our usual environment. Even if that is, really not the case. So we moved into a different culture. And if we're not aware of that, if the coachee is not aware of that, then there'll be misunderstandings, conflicts, and just a gap between people's intentions and what people make of their behavior. Okay. Thanks. So, looking back at the broad brush of combined forces of physical environments, of being in systems, of organizational forces, of how groups and teams operate and the kind of momentums that build and how they affect all of us. Let's now spend a few minutes tying this up and discussing implications and best practices for coaching. Okay, and we can also come back to this when we go into the Q&A part of the session. So the first point is really, as a coach, sometimes it's really up to us to remind people that they're part of an environment. And we also know how important the environment is. So By no means am I encouraging you to spend, a lot of time or primarily your coaching time on talking about the system, but certainly checking to see, to understand the lay of the land, to understand how the coachee, where they are in the system, how they're responding to different types of the system, if there are any kind of ruptures or important relationships that are broken or different subgroups and so on that actually are affecting them, both their well-being and might have a direct impact on the reasons that they're coming in to be coached, but also affect their decision-making, the way they behave, their alliances, their values. That's another very important thing. And then also looking at the changes that are happening in the coachee system and the types of knock-on effects that they're having on the individual. Okay, so at this point, I would say at minimum, look at the system, try to understand it, and if there are any areas that are raising questions in your mind, that's a clue to continue to explore them. Okay. And this is part of really broadening the perspective. So how do other parts of the system perceive the coachee? And here you can do things such as just asking them. So when you behaved in the way that you just described, what was the impact on your team, on your peers, on your boss, etc. With some people, it will be easier for them to step into that space. With others, you can, doing things like role plays can be very helpful. So let's pretend that I am your direct report and you are having this difficult conversation. So you can do dry runs. You can do that playing a role, or you can do that by asking questions. So when you said this to the other person, what was the impact on them? How did that make them feel? How do you think they leave the room? What was their reaction? And here you help them see that their actions kind of ripple and affect people, and that can really help in terms of narrowing down the issue and also expanding in terms of how to take steps to improve things. Okay. Looking at people's roles. So if we look at the importance of a role in a system, so whatever title you have comes with certain expectations. And people sometimes forget them. So obviously the KPIs are clear and so on. But when it comes to really thinking, okay, as a newly appointed CFO, what am I here to do? How are people looking up to a board member? How are the team looking up to me in my role? And by having that kind of discussion, you can help your coachee start thinking about kind of how they would like to impact, and it also gives a really good anchor in terms of making decisions and in terms of behaving and in terms of stepping into their authority. Okay, so you can use the role as a way to leverage different types of behaviors. Transitions, which almost by definition means the environment around the coachee has changed. They are often a kind of a tension point. Sometimes it's before the transition actually happens. Sometimes it's a little bit afterwards. But the changes in environment and looking at them and using coaching as a space to explore them, to understand what the coachee, where things resonate with them, what they're familiar with, what is new to them, and how they are responding to that new environment, and then to empower them in a way that is much more informed can be especially critical. So I would say almost when you're coaching someone through transitions, asking about the differences between their previous environment and the new environment, between the previous role and the new one, is very, very often a very rich area of discussion and of coaching, and you can really support and open up possibilities for your coachee. Physical changes. So this in itself, how things look, anything from physical attire to titles to where people's, how their offices are, where they are, who they socialize with. So kind of the visible symbols that people give out. Sometimes this plays a role. It's not a, even how somebody, are they dressed for the role, or the way they are showing up? Does that fit with the expectations that people have from them? And if not, again, having that kind of discussion around what the signals that they are sending out to the system are, and then understanding what the expectations of the system are from them. Okay. And the final point around leading teams or team leaders. So even if you are coaching individuals who are bringing to the coaching session some challenges around how they're working with their team, how they're able to influence, etc., etc. Here you can help them think about the effects of the team, but also certainly if they're team leaders, then helping them structure processes. So how the team works. You might even join in some team meetings and try to pull out silent voices, try to call out people to avoid groupthink, try to challenge assumptions, try to really check with people around the level of buy-in that they are really experiencing, try to even mix up the teams or where people sit and so on. But coaches can really bring this whole area of avoiding groupthink and bringing diversity, both of people and of thinking and of decision making, into an organizational context. Okay. So let's now move to some questions that we can use the remaining time to discuss.
So can I begin just by thanking Eyal on all our behalves for taking us through that very thorough and structured exploration of the field there. So really many thanks, Eyal, for that. We've got some questions that have come in on the chat, on the chat. If others of you have questions, please by all means add them. Just to start with, Eyal, on some of the research, some of the famous research on mirror neurons, Katie has asked, has there been more recent research that has called into question or undermined some of the claims that are made about that? And in the same context, I know I've seen recently articles now about Milgram and Zimbardo seeming to want to undermine it. And I just wondered what your view was about where those things are.
Yes, so the Zimbardo and the Milgram experiments, first of all, the whole ethical aspect of things has gone beyond being questioned. It is really seen as, absolutely wrong, would never be replicated again today for many, many very right reasons. In terms of the findings, there have been different explanations. There have been ways to explain what has happened from other perspectives apart from just obedience and just the power of the group. But even those that looked at maybe, there were certain individuals and it was about individual differences that has really determined how people behaved, I'm not aware of an argument that has actually brought down the whole notion of the power of a group to affect how people behave. Okay, and the Milgram experiment has actually been replicated in far milder variations to in many other settings, and the 65%, 2/3 of people responding, in ways only because authority has said so, is pretty consistent. Okay, mirror neurons it's a new and emergent area. So I don't think the final word is in yet, but to my understanding, I mean, it's considered to be a finding. I think the explanation and the extent and exactly how this works is there's no final word on that. But as far as I'm aware, it's still a live topic.
Fine, thank you. Catherine Andrews has a question around risky shift, and asked, could you say a bit more about that? And also, is there other things that you might direct her or others to read on that?
Okay. So risky shift. So let's think of it as kind of an umbrella term of the kinds of things that build up and the kinds of mistakes that groups can make because of things like groupthink and the polarization that happens and the closed-mindedness that happens. So a coach would want to do anything that would increase the diversity of thinking, so that would let new information in and allow information that is not being said by members of the group to be expressed. So that might mean that people don't really agree with what the CO has just, said, but they will feel that they cannot really voice that. So a good coach would come and really shine a light and encourage people to express different thoughts, for instance. Bring people in from the outside. Okay, that's another way. So bringing kind of counter arguments, counter points of views, to encourage debate, to help assess risk. Okay, so these are things that can bring down the polarization. Increasing personal accountability. So here you're to maybe counteract the effect of the group, you're actually trying to almost remind people that they have an individual role to play. Okay, so it's not we are accountable, it's, you are accountable for this and you are accountable for that, etc., which then kind of changes how people respond and brings other things to the fore.
I know one idea which is used is giving certain people the official role of being the devil's advocate to kick the tires and test what people might be missing.
Absolutely.
And in my own experience, coaching individuals, sometimes I found people found that a really attractive idea, that they might step up and own that role in order to contribute in meetings and channel their thinking productively, helpfully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So anything that can disturb the system a little bit, or disturb the forces that counter good, open decision making.
And there's an observation from David Crow there, not a question, but just an observation that it shows just how important diversity is.
Absolutely.
Particularly in groups, because the research is really quite alarming about the power of that influence.
Absolutely. And we see that all around us on so many levels. We read about it in the news every day. We see it happen in pretty much every organization we might belong to. And it's both in terms of demographics, people, groups, and then there's subgroups, and then, the forces of of kind of splitting and the lack of diversity of approaches and perspectives always, it never aids decision making. It never helps to actually evolve things in a way that benefits everyone. And then the diversity of thinking, which I think we've talked about a lot.
And what strikes me is the power of the subtle pressure to conform in those situations. I grew up in a law firm culture. A lot of law firm partnerships claim to operate by consensus. And in practice, what that can mean is those people who agree should speak up and support the proposition, and the others should be very careful about what they say in meetings.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
And in fact, I was talking to chairman of a, now retired, but chairman of a very large FTSE 100 company. And he was saying, I don't like this Zoom, all these people on here, you don't know what their views are and you haven't got time to hear them. Much simpler in board meetings. I already know what people think because I've heard it before. So we don't need to hear from them all, which is a different view of how to deal with risk and arrive at decision-making.
Indeed.
In groups.
Indeed. And beware the excuse of, we don't have time to get into that.
Mm. Yeah. And of course, it means you have to, the bigger challenge is to create a culture which is receptive to uncertainty, difference, isn't it?
Yes, that sees it as a necessity, really.
Which or rather chairman I was talking to would not like.
Yeah, all information is needed. I mean, if you're not including all the information, how can you take the right decision?
Thank you. Now, David has raised a point about the ripple effect, and I think the point here is this may be a positive impact of context and environment, where there can be secondary and subsequent indirect impact. I mean, I'm assuming that's what David's thinking. I suppose it could be negative too, but
yes.
I just wondered what your thoughts were about that.
Okay, it's most powerful. So this is where things like role modeling behaviors comes in. So if there is a resonance between what the explicit values of an organization are and people actually behave in those ways, then that ripple effect is magnified. Okay. If there's a dissonance between them, then people will look more at what you do and how you behave. They will look at that and give more weight to that than any kind of official or formal or explicit message. So role modeling has a stronger ripple effect than just verbal statements. And yes, it can be positive and negative.
I know the Institute of Coaching has some research on its website by someone called O'Connor. I can't remember his first name, but on precisely this, the ripple effect and the effect on the, not just on the person you coach, but how that reaches out into the organization 2 or 3 levels out and demonstrating some of that impact.
Yes. And many coachees, they feel like the obstacle is in them because they're not able to push through a decision or promote something they believe in. And then, after a while, it actually transpires that it's their manager who is under pressure, and therefore is the blockage rather than them. So things cascade throughout the system, indeed.
So if I can look through some of the other questions that have come in. There was a question I saw. What advice, this is from Julia Sherlock, what advice would you give when the group is led by a leader who rules by fear?
Mm-hmm. Bring in a coach. I think it's depending on who you're working with. So if you're working with the leader, you would work on looking at that leadership style. If, however, you're working with the recipient, so a team member rather than the leader, then you'd want to really try to help them articulate kind of how that affects them, and then find the spaces in between the fear, perhaps, where they can start to have more of an impact. Now, I'm saying that because it's very hard to change a system. Okay, it's easier to change the ways people behave, but as a one person who is part of a larger system, I think you can empower them, and you should empower them, and maybe work with them. Okay, fear is the way that things are working in this group. So let's look at how you can operate within that context, and what can you bring to the table. So given that, basically, a reality.
Thank you.
Unless you're coaching the team, of course.
So I have a question here from Sally Woodward asking, could you say a little bit more about how to introduce these things where the client seems unaware without risking hijacking the client's agenda?
Okay. So you would kind of do that in the first part of the kind of getting to know you, kind of understanding the coachee's world. So they would come to you with a presenting issue, and they would tell you about what they've been trying to do and the obstacles in their way and so on. And one natural kind of segue into the system is when you hear them starting to introduce into the coaching space between you and them names and roles of other people. Okay, so that's so you can do it initially just by tell me a little bit more about that, or is that usual, or does that represent a change in the relationship you've had with this person or with this group? So you're starting to just really bring into the discussion other players. Okay, so that's one way. In other instances where sometimes, and this can depend on the personality of the coachee. So some coachees, they come and they tend to take a lot of responsibility on themselves, and perhaps also the blame on themselves. And here, as a coach, you can just remind them that actually there are other people involved here, and then start, for instance, a system mapping, to start unpacking that, and to then help look at who else has a stake in this, and therefore whose response, where does the responsibility lie, what do I have control over, and where do I not have control over? And that's also a very good question that can really help throw up limitations of a system. So what is under my control and what is not?
It's a really interesting point, isn't it? That Covey thing. One of my concerns, but what's the circle of actual control or influence?
Yeah.
You've talked about the systems map. Do you use constellations or symbolic tokens to help people explore relationships?
Some people do, and it ranges. I mean, I know the constellations where are done actually in groups where people play different roles representing others in the system. So I myself do not. I'm not trained in that. I tend to stick more to the systems map, and asking the question. So when this happened, what do you think the effect was on person B? To try and help people shift perspective by getting into the mind of other players within the system.
Right.
But if there are obviously other ways of doing that, and they're all legitimate, and if they work, that's great.
Lovely. Let's see. Yes, this is from Elaine Teo, and it says, do you have examples, actual case studies possibly, of some of the suggestions that you outlined in the last slide? And could you walk us through how you've found some of these have worked and when you've applied them with the coachee in real situations?
Okay. So looking at the last slide, so the broadening the perspective. So here, like I mentioned, things like doing these role plays. and just asking the person, okay, so I'm hearing from you that when you did this, the other person responded in that way and went to complain about you, or whatever happened. So really shifting the conversation from what's going on in the coach's head to what might be. And as a coach, you're just helping them imagine things. What might be the effect on the other person when that was said? So very good way to, if the story is too simple, if the coach is just coming out, oh, this is the only reason why this and this happened, or why this is an obstacle, then I think part of our role as a coach in working with the system's mind is actually to make it a little bit more complicated. It's another way of saying kind of, it's not as simple as that. There are other parts of the story that are going on. So expanding that. When we look at physical, so for instance, I work with someone who was promoted, but there was this kind of nagging feeling that they didn't feel that they're really part of senior leadership. They didn't feel that they have the respect. They were promoted from within their team. So even things like, okay, have you moved your desk? Because if you haven't, then in some ways you're still seen by others as some of the team. Also in terms of how people kind of decide to dress in organizations, where there's kind of a level of formality that roughly tracks different levels of the organization. And here you can hit across things where people either don't miss something about the system, or actually have an issue with parts of the system. So I've seen that sometimes when people were nominated to become part of an executive committee, but they kept talking about us and them, me and them, giving, and what I heard as a coach is a lot around, I don't belong, I'm not part of that group really. And then opening up that conversation and understanding how this new environment works and what are the values, and then working with the systems map to find some allies, for instance.
That's very interesting, and needing to make the shift from one group to another.
Yes.
Recognize that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And it reminded me, just on some of that, the impact, well, part of it, your example there is of someone not stepping into the new role. The other example that, again, is quite common in the legal sector is when people get promoted to partner, having what's referred to as a personality bypass at that moment, where they step so heavily into the role that they seem to change completely.
Yes.
Again,
yeah.
the power of the role.
Yes. And sometimes people taking it on actually a little bigger than, than they do. But you can read it really as a reflection of the power of the system and the power of the roles in that system, and how we respond to that unconsciously, but in very real ways.
And in relation to that, I've got a question from John Baldry here. How much does the role people have been used to playing in their lives affect this? How can you address that in the context of the system they're now in?
Okay. Great question. And this brings us a little bit to systems theory. Actually is very broadly used in things like family therapy. So it does go into family systems and how early environments have shaped us. And many family therapists work with that. So looking at it from the point of view that, it's not the child who's, a brat, it's how they are being reared and what they see happening elsewhere in the system. And the longer we are in a system, the more we take on the values and behaviors of that system. And that also means that it's more difficult for us to change them. So it runs deep, and we bring with us both the historical kind of earlier childhood, as well as the history of roles and organizations and positions that we brought with us from our other places of work.
Okay, so it's possible that we and our clients might be manifesting behaviours that are not being particularly driven by the environment we're in, but one we've come from. Is that what you're saying?
When we bring a history,
Yeah.
okay, we have a playbook because that's what we learned and that's how we adapted, and that's what worked for us, you know, in the last 10 years. So if we're not aware of or not appreciating how different this new system is, then we will act in one way that does not fit the new situation. And that's where the troubles, you know, start. And another tool you can use is, okay, so in this new environment, now that we understand a little bit better, what behaviors will you need to let go of? Which behaviors should you keep, and which other new behaviors, you know, should you be looking to acquire? So that's another, you know, very simple model that is highly relevant here too.
Lovely, thank you. So one more question I'd like to come to before we need to stop, and that's from Julia Sherlock. And is there anything you can say about helping someone who's been furloughed and feels undervalued by their organisation or their boss as a result?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so I mean, there will be certainly the systems part. Intuitively doesn't sound like it would play a large role here. Okay, so it might be a relatively smaller part of the discussion. As you work with the coachee, you'd want to, I think, focus on what is alive for them in this experience. So were they let down? Were they, do they feel mistreated? Is it unfair? Have they drawn conclusions around, well, I should have been more like this to succeed? And work with that. And then you can explore the system that they came from and what were the values, for instance, and where they find themselves as you're actually preparing them to join a new system after letting go of the old system. So some of it is really coming to terms with being ejected from a previous system. And then slowly with time on maybe having more choice around what kind of systems they would want to belong to in the future as they are looking to the next chapter.
And I guess also sort of think about sort of Nancy Klein lens, you know, what are they assuming around the meaning of being furloughed for them? And what evidence have they got for those assumptions that they're holding?
Absolutely. And they will blame, you know, blame is maybe too strong a word. They're responding to the system, you know, and it can really make them feel, you know, make them direct the negativity either to the system or sometimes to themselves. And then part of the coach's role is really to make sure that, you know, they're not taking it all on themselves, but seeing what parts of it belong to the system and saying goodbye in a way that leaves them free and open to enter into other systems from a place where they will think about actually what is important for them in terms of, let's say, values in the next system that they wish to belong to.
Brilliant, thank you. So we need to bring this to close. Thank you so much for taking us through that, Eyal, and for dealing with all the questions as well. Thank you also to all those who've been listening for the questions you've asked, and my apologies to those of you that we didn't get round to putting. It's been very instructive, so many thanks. And over to Alana.
Thank you.
Well, so I just wanted to round things off. So thank you to Eyal and thank you to Des for a great webinar, and thank you to everyone who attended today. We hope you enjoyed the session, and we look forward to seeing you at another Meyler Campbell virtual webinar soon. So thanks again. Bye-bye.